There's a place in California where the ground has been whispering secrets nobody wanted to hear. January 4th, 2026. While you were scrolling through your phone, a magnitude 5.7 earthquake rippled through the ocean floor off Africa's coast, and 12,000 kilometers away, seismic monitors in San Francisco suddenly lit up like a pinball machine. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the planet just sent a message we're only now learning to read. Beneath your feet, something ancient is waking up. Something that's been quiet for all of recorded history. Stay until the end, because what's happening right now isn't about if California breaks off. It's about when, and what that actually means for the map of North America. Subscribe and follow along, because the deep seismic reverberations are still propagating through the crust, and what we're witnessing right now is merely the opening act of something bigger. January 4th, 2026. You probably didn't feel anything that day. Most people didn't. But somewhere in the halls of the United States Geological Survey, in the quiet offices where seismologists monitor the planet's restless crust, something changed. A magnitude 5.7 earthquake rippled through the mid-African Antarctic ridge, a remote stretch of oceanic crust where Africa and Antarctica are slowly pulling apart. The quake itself was unremarkable by geological standards, the kind of event that happens dozens of times each year along the world's spreading ridges. Nobody was hurt. No buildings collapsed. The seismic energy dissipated into the Atlantic Ocean like a whisper into wind. Except it didn't quite dissipate. Not all of it. Here's where things get interesting, and a little strange. Every earthquake sends waves racing through the entire planet. Some waves travel along the surface. Others plunge straight through Earth's interior, refracting through different layers like light through a prism. These deep waves converge at a very specific place on the opposite side of the globe, what seismologists call the antipodal point. It's basic physics, nothing mystical about it. Seismic energy naturally focuses at the point directly opposite the epicenter, like squeezing a balloon on one side and feeling the pressure build on the other. The phenomenon is well documented, measured, verified. What's not well understood is whether that focused energy can actually trigger anything. The antipodal point of that January 4th African quake sits almost exactly beneath the San Francisco Bay Area. Within hours of the initial event, monitoring stations across Northern California began registering something that made analysts lean forward in their chairs. Not a single large quake, but a subtle shift in background seismic noise. The kind of change that doesn't make headlines, but gets flagged in internal reports. Elevated alert language started appearing in technical briefings. Not public warnings, mind you, but the kind of carefully worded assessments that seismologists use when they're not quite sure what they're looking at, but know it's worth watching. You have to understand how rare this is. The Earth is always shaking somewhere. At any given moment, thousands of microquakes rumble through the crust, too small to feel, but large enough to register on sensitive instruments. This creates what scientists call seismic background noise, the constant static hum of a planet in motion. What happened after January 4th wasn't a dramatic spike. It was more like the pitch changing, the rhythm shifting slightly out of phase. Multiple independent monitoring systems, using different technologies and methodologies, began flagging stress changes within days of the African event. Not one system, multiple systems, all seeing something similar, but not identical. Now, before we go any further, we need to be very clear about what we're not saying here. We are not claiming that an earthquake in Africa caused anything in California. That's not how this works. Seismic triggering is one of the most contentious topics in earthquake science precisely because proving causation is nearly impossible. There are simply too many variables, too many forces acting on the crust at any given time. But here's what we can say with confidence. Something changed in the stress field beneath Northern California, and the timing is difficult to ignore. This brings us to what some researchers quietly call the resonant crust hypothesis. It's speculative, debated, and definitely not mainstream science yet. The idea is that Earth's crust might behave less like a collection of isolated faults and more like a mechanically coupled shell, where disturbances in one region can propagate through the entire system in ways we're only beginning to understand. Think of it like a drumhead. Strike one part and the whole surface vibrates, not just the point of impact. Could the crust work similarly? Could stress changes ripple through the planet's outer layer, conditioning faults thousands of kilometers away? History offers some tantalizing parallels. The 1960 Chilean earthquake, magnitude 9.5, the largest ever recorded, was preceded by increased seismic activity across the Pacific Rim. The 2004 Sumatra quake occurred after months of elevated background tremors. The 2011 Tohoku disaster in Japan came at the end of a decade-long uptick in regional seismicity. None of these patterns prove anything on their own. Correlation is not causation, as every scientist will remind you. But the patterns exist, documented in the seismic record, waiting for an explanation that doesn't quite fit our current models. What makes the current situation different, what makes it worth paying attention to right now, is that we're not just talking about one signal. We're talking about multiple systems responding as if the crust had been genuinely perturbed. As if something beneath California received the energy from that African quake and hasn't finished processing it yet. The antipodal focusing could be entirely coincidental, or it could be one piece of a much larger puzzle that we're only now starting to see clearly. If this were just theory, if it were only mathematical models and speculative papers published in obscure journals, Susanville wouldn't matter. But Susanville does matter. Because 260 kilometers northeast of Sacramento, something is happening that doesn't fit the normal pattern of California seismicity. Something that makes the antipodal connection feel less like coincidence and more like confirmation. We'll get to Susanville in a moment, but first you need to understand why a swarm of earthquakes in the middle of nowhere has seismologists more concerned than coastal tremors ever did. Because if the crust really is responding as a coupled system, the question isn't whether California will shake. The question is where the first real rupture will begin. Susanville, California. Population roughly 18,000, nestled in the northeastern corner of the state where the Sierra Nevada begins its long march toward the Oregon border. Most Americans couldn't find it on a map. Most Californians drive past it on Highway 36 without a second thought. But if you've been following seismic monitoring reports over the past 2 weeks, Susanville has become one of the most discussed locations in earthquake science. Not because anything catastrophic happened there, but because of what's happening there right now. Continuously, stubbornly, in a pattern that doesn't match what seismologists expect from normal fault behavior. December 30th, 2025. A magnitude 4.2 earthquake struck just west of Susanville, shallow and sharp. Not large enough to cause significant damage, but strong enough to rattle windows and knock items off shelves. Local residents posted videos of swaying chandeliers and car alarms blaring in unison. By January 2nd, smaller quakes began clustering in the same area. Magnitude 2.8, 3.1, another 2.9. Then dozens of microquakes too small to feel, but clearly visible on seismograms. This continued through January 4th, the day of the African antipodal event, and it hasn't stopped. As of this recording, the Susanville area has experienced over 200 detectable seismic events in the span of 2 weeks. Seismologists have a term for this: a seismic swarm. Unlike a typical earthquake sequence, where you get a main shock followed by progressively smaller aftershocks that taper off over days or weeks, a swarm consists of many earthquakes of similar magnitude with no clear main event. Swarms happen all the time, particularly in volcanic regions or areas with active geothermal systems. The Earth's crust shifts, fluids move through fractures, pressure redistributes, and you get this persistent shaking that eventually dies down. Usually within days, sometimes within hours. The key word there is eventually. What's happening near Susanville isn't behaving like a typical swarm. First, there's the geographic clustering. These quakes aren't spreading out along a fault line or migrating in a clear direction. They're hammering the same general location repeatedly, like someone tapping the same spot on a cracked windshield. Second, there's the depth consistency. Most of these events are occurring between 5 and 10 kilometers beneath the surface, in what seismologists call the seismogenic zone, the part of the crust where rocks are brittle enough to fracture suddenly, but deep enough to accumulate significant strain. Depth matters more than most people realize. When seismologists report earthquake depths, they're working with estimates based on how seismic waves arrive at different stations. The calculations aren't perfect, but they're good enough to distinguish between shallow events near the surface and deeper ruptures in the mid-crust. Shallow quakes, those less than 5 kilometers deep, often involve surface processes like landslides or human activity. Deep quakes, anything below 15 kilometers, occur where rocks are hot enough to deform more plastically, absorbing stress rather than releasing it suddenly. The 5 to 10 kilometer range is the sweet spot where strain accumulates and releases explosively. That's where Susanville is shaking. Then there are the water reports. Multiple residents in the Susanville area have reported changes in well water quality, describing increased turbidity, a cloudy or murky appearance that wasn't there before. This is a verified phenomenon in earthquake science. When the crust fractures, even in small ways, it can disturb aquifers and alter groundwater flow. This isn't about pipes breaking or infrastructure damage. This is about mechanical energy transferring through rock, compressing water-bearing layers, forcing sediment into suspension. It's a signal that something is moving down there, reshaping the subsurface in ways that aren't immediately visible from the surface. Why does any of this matter? Why should a swarm of small earthquakes in a remote part of California deserve more attention than the constant seismic activity along the San Andreas Fault near major population centers? Because Susanville sits in the eastern Sierra, at the western edge of a much larger and more mysterious fault system called the Walker Lane. And the Walker Lane, despite being largely unknown to the general public, may be the most important tectonic feature in North America right now. The Walker Lane fault system runs for roughly 1,000 kilometers from eastern California into Nevada, a complex network of faults that accommodates somewhere between 15 and 25% of the motion between the Pacific and North American plates. That's not a small amount. That's enough motion to build mountains, to open valleys, to fundamentally reshape the geology of an entire region over geologic time. For decades, scientists assumed the San Andreas Fault handled most of the plate boundary motion. The Walker Lane was treated as secondary, a minor player in the grand tectonic drama of the American West. Recent research suggests that assumption was wrong. What seismologists are quietly discussing right now in technical papers and conference presentations is whether the Susanville swarm represents what they carefully call a pre-shock environment. Not a prediction, mind you. That word carries too much weight, implies too much certainty, but a descriptive state, a recognition that the crust in this region is behaving the way it sometimes behaves before something larger happens. The fact that the swarm isn't migrating, isn't spreading along a known fault, makes it more alarming, not less. When seismic activity migrates, it suggests stress is releasing progressively along a fault plane. When it stays clustered, it suggests stress is building in a confined area, like pressure in a sealed container. Compare this to Ridgecrest. In 2019, the town of Ridgecrest in Southern California experienced a magnitude 6.4 earthquake, followed by a magnitude 7.1 event the next day. That sequence was preceded by weeks of increased background seismicity in the region, small quakes that nobody paid much attention to until the larger events hit. Seismologists later analyzed the pre-shock activity and found patterns similar to what's happening near Susanville now. Similar, not identical. Earthquakes don't repeat precisely, but the family resemblance is there, documented in the data, impossible to ignore completely. None of this means a large earthquake is guaranteed. Swarms can peter out. Stress can redistribute without major rupture. The crust can absorb changes that seem dramatic on human timescales, but amount to nothing on geological timescales. Uncertainty is the only honest position in earthquake science. But uncertainty cuts both ways. We can't predict when or where the next big quake will strike, but we also can't rule out the possibility that we're watching the early stages of something significant. And if the Susanville swarm is connected to larger processes in the Walker Lane, if it's a surface expression of deeper changes in how the plate boundary is organized, then what's happening beneath California right now isn't just a local phenomenon. It's a restructuring event, the kind that happens once every few thousand years. The kind that rewrites maps and redefines what we think we know about earthquake hazards. Susanville only matters if something larger is changing underneath, and all the evidence suggests something is. For most of the 20th century, California earthquake science revolved around one fault, the San Andreas. It's the superstar, the household name, the 800-mile gash through the state that everyone knows will eventually produce the big one. Textbooks featured it prominently. Disaster movies made it infamous. Urban planning and building codes were designed around its inevitable rupture. The San Andreas became synonymous with California earthquake risk, and for good reason. It's where two tectonic plates meet, where the Pacific plate grinds past the North American plate at roughly 46 millimeters per year, accumulating strain that will eventually release in magnitude 7 or 8 earthquakes. Everything we built, everything we prepared for, assumed the San Andreas would remain the dominant plate boundary for centuries to come. Except plate boundaries don't stay in one place forever. They migrate, they reorganize, they shift inland or seaward, depending on how stresses distribute through the crust. And over the past few decades, as GPS monitoring became precise enough to track millimeter-scale movements, scientists began noticing something unexpected. The San Andreas wasn't accommodating as much plate motion as it should. Some of the movement, a significant percentage, was happening elsewhere. Specifically, it was happening along the Walker Lane. The Walker Lane fault system stretches for approximately 1,000 kilometers, from the eastern Sierra in California through western Nevada and into Oregon. It's not a single fault, but a diffuse network of fractures, folds, and shear zones that collectively accommodate 15 to 25% of the motion between the Pacific and North American plates. That translates to roughly 12 millimeters of movement per year, comparable to the slip rates on major faults in other tectonic settings. 12 millimeters might sound trivial, the thickness of a few coins stacked together, but in tectonics, 12 millimeters per year is substantial. Over a century, that's 1.2 meters of displacement. Over 10,000 years, it's 120 meters. Over 1,000,000 years, it's enough to rip continents apart. This movement doesn't happen smoothly. Faults don't slide continuously like conveyor belts. They lock, they accumulate strain, and they rupture suddenly when the accumulated stress exceeds the strength of the rock. This is called stick-slip behavior, and it's why earthquakes happen at all. The Walker Lane is currently in a locked state, accumulating strain that hasn't been released in any major seismic event in recorded history. We know this from what geologists call the shallow slip deficit. GPS measurements show that the surface is moving at 12 millimeters per year, but when researchers examine geological features offset by faults, they find less displacement than expected over recent decades. This means most of the movement is occurring at depth, stored as elastic strain in the crust, waiting for release. What makes the Walker Lane particularly concerning is that it represents what geophysicists call an immature plate boundary. Unlike the San Andreas, which has been the primary plate boundary for millions of years and has well-defined fault traces and relatively predictable behavior, the Walker Lane is still evolving. It's a boundary in transition, a network of faults that are linking together, organizing themselves into a coherent system. Immature boundaries are unpredictable precisely because they haven't established stable patterns yet. The rules are still being written, the geometry still being worked out through trial and error, through earthquakes that test different configurations until one becomes dominant. Here's where the popular narrative about California breaking off needs serious correction. You've probably seen headlines claiming California will snap off into the ocean, that Los Angeles and San Francisco will become islands, that the state is on the verge of catastrophic separation. That's not how this works. California isn't going to dramatically split and drift away like an iceberg. What's actually happening is much slower, but geologically just as significant. The plate boundary, the zone where Pacific and North American plates interact, is migrating eastward. Not overnight, not even over decades, but over hundreds of thousands to millions of years. If this migration continues, and all evidence suggests it will, the Walker Lane could eventually become the primary plate boundary, with the San Andreas becoming a secondary feature or even an inactive relic. This has happened before in Earth's history. Plate boundaries migrate all the time. The East African Rift is slowly creating a new ocean. The Red Sea was once an inland rift that opened to become a marine basin. The Atlantic Ocean itself formed when a continental rift zone became an active spreading center. California isn't unique in this process. It's just happening in a place where millions of people live, and where we have the technology to watch it unfold in real time. The timeline matters enormously here. Full continental separation, if it happens at all, is millions of years away. Nobody alive today will see California become an island. But hazard redistribution, the shift of earthquake risk from coastal faults to inland faults, is happening right now. The Walker Lane isn't waiting millions of years to become seismically significant. It's already capable of producing magnitude 7 earthquakes. The geological record shows evidence of massive prehistoric ruptures along sections of the system. The ground hasn't forgotten how to break catastrophically. It's just been quiet during the brief period of recorded history. What changed recently isn't the Walker Lane itself, but our understanding of how active it really is. GPS networks that came online in the 1990s revealed motion rates that surprised researchers. Paleoseismic trenching, where scientists dig through fault zones to find evidence of past earthquakes, uncovered ruptures much larger and more frequent than anyone expected. Seismic monitoring stations deployed across Nevada started detecting micro-earthquakes that mapped out active faults nobody knew existed. The picture that emerged wasn't of a stable, secondary fault system, but of a dynamic, evolving plate boundary that was taking over more tectonic responsibility with each passing century. Mechanical stress alone doesn't fully explain why the Walker Lane is activating now rather than 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years from now. Plate motion is relatively steady over human timescales. The forces driving Pacific-North American interaction haven't changed dramatically in recent decades. So why is the crust responding differently now? Why are monitoring systems picking up changes in seismic activity patterns? Why did Susanville start shaking persistently in late 2025? Mechanical stress provides the potential energy, but something else might be influencing the timing, the triggering, the way stored strain releases. And that's where the story gets genuinely strange, where we have to consider forces that don't appear in standard earthquake models, but might matter more than anyone wants to admit. Because the energy nobody is accounting for might be coming from above. Solar Cycle 25 began in December 2019, marking the start of the Sun's latest 11-year cycle of magnetic activity. For most of human history, solar cycles were invisible to us, noticed only when particularly intense geomagnetic storms created spectacular auroras or disrupted telegraph systems. Modern civilization, with its dependence on satellites, power grids, and GPS networks, pays much closer attention. We monitor sunspot numbers, track coronal mass ejections, and issue space weather forecasts the same way we forecast hurricanes. Cycle 25 was initially predicted to be relatively weak, similar to the previous cycle, with modest magnetic activity and few major storms. That prediction is looking increasingly incorrect. Since mid-2024, the Sun has produced multiple X-class solar flares, the most powerful category in the classification system. Several of these events were accompanied by coronal mass ejections, massive eruptions of plasma and magnetic field that travel through space at millions of kilometers per hour. When these plasma clouds reach Earth, they interact with our planet's magnetic field, compressing it, distorting it, driving electric currents through the upper atmosphere and into the ground below. These are called geomagnetic storms, and they're measured on a scale from G1, minor, to G5, extreme. Cycle 25 has already produced several G3 and G4 storms, with more likely on the way as the cycle approaches its maximum phase. What does any of this have to do with earthquakes? On the surface, nothing. The standard model of earthquake physics is purely mechanical. Tectonic plates push against each other. Stress accumulates in locked fault zones. And when stress exceeds rock strength, rupture occurs. Solar activity doesn't appear in the equations. Geomagnetic storms don't factor into seismic hazard assessments. The scientific mainstream treats these as completely separate phenomena, as unrelated as ocean tides and volcanic eruptions. Except they might not be as separate as we think. There's a small but persistent body of research, published in peer-reviewed journals, but largely ignored by the broader seismology community, suggesting that electromagnetic phenomena can influence fault behavior. The mechanism is subtle and indirect. Geomagnetic storms drive electric currents through the Earth's crust, particularly through conductive pathways like groundwater-saturated rock, and fault zones filled with what geologists call fault gouge, the crushed rock and mineral debris produced by repeated faulting. These currents don't cause earthquakes directly. They're far too weak to fracture rock, but they might alter the properties of faults in ways that affect how and when stored strain releases. Consider fault friction. Earthquakes occur when frictional resistance along a fault is overcome by tectonic stress. Friction itself isn't a simple property. It depends on temperature, pressure, the presence of fluids, and the mineral composition of fault surfaces. Laboratory experiments have shown that electric currents passing through rock samples can change their mechanical properties, altering how they respond to stress. The effects are small, measurable in percentage points, but earthquake triggering is notoriously sensitive to tiny perturbations. A fault that's close to failure, that's already accumulated strain to near its breaking point, doesn't need a large push. It needs the right push, applied at the right time, in the right way. Now, add another layer. The plasmasphere, a region of cold, dense plasma that surrounds Earth's inner magnetosphere, typically recovers within days after a geomagnetic storm. Recent observations from NASA satellites show that recovery times during Cycle 25 have been longer than expected, sometimes stretching into weeks. Why this is happening remains unclear. It might be related to the specific magnetic configuration of the current cycle, or to cumulative effects from multiple storms in close succession. What matters for our purposes is that longer recovery times mean Earth's electromagnetic environment remains perturbed for extended periods, maintaining electrical conditions that don't occur during quieter solar cycles. This is where we enter genuinely speculative territory. The idea of electromechanical coupling in earthquake systems, the notion that electromagnetic forces might condition fault behavior, is not mainstream science. It's debated, controversial, and lacks the kind of definitive proof that would convince skeptics. There's no earthquake switch that solar activity flips. No direct one-to-one causation between geomagnetic storms and specific seismic events. But causation and conditioning are different things. A conditioned system is one that's been pushed closer to a threshold, made more sensitive to subsequent triggers. If electromagnetic currents can alter fault properties even slightly, and if those alterations persist for weeks during extended plasmasphere recovery, then a fault that might have remained locked for another year could fail this month instead. Historical data offers tantalizing but inconclusive patterns. Some researchers have found weak correlations between major earthquakes and preceding periods of elevated solar activity. Others have found no correlation at all. The problem is sample size. Large earthquakes are rare events, and solar cycles are complex phenomena with multiple overlapping timescales. Separating signal from noise requires more data than we currently have. We'd need centuries of high-quality seismic and solar monitoring to say anything definitive. We have decades at best, and even that data is contaminated by improving instrumentation and changing monitoring networks. Tidal forces, the gravitational pull of the moon and sun, have been studied as potential earthquake triggers for over a century. The consensus is that tidal stresses are too small to cause earthquakes, but might advance the timing of quakes that were already imminent. The effect is detectable statistically, but negligible practically. If tidal forces, which are well understood and easily calculated, can only advance timing by hours or days, what could electromagnetic effects do? Probably something similar, if they do anything at all. A slight advancement of timing, a subtle redistribution of probability. Nothing dramatic or predictable. Why bring this up at all if the science is so uncertain? Because the Walker lane is not responding to mechanical stress alone. The timing of increased activity doesn't align neatly with changes in plate motion or with any known mechanical trigger. The Susanville swarm started in late December, during a period of elevated solar activity and extended plasmasphere recovery. The African antipodal event occurred during a G1 geomagnetic storm. These could all be coincidences. Probably are coincidences. But if there's even a small chance that electromagnetic phenomena play a conditioning role, that they make faults more sensitive to mechanical triggers, then ignoring this possibility is itself a choice with consequences. The standard earthquake model assumes faults exist in a purely mechanical environment, responding only to tectonic forces and pore pressure changes. That model works well most of the time, but it struggles to explain timing clusters, periods where multiple large earthquakes occur in rapid succession across unconnected fault systems. The 2010 to 2011 period saw major quakes in Haiti, Chile, New Zealand, and Japan within 16 months. The 2004 Indian Ocean quake was followed by large events in Pakistan, Indonesia, and the Solomon Islands. These clusters might be random, or they might reflect global changes in fault sensitivity driven by forces we don't fully understand yet. Forces that might include electromagnetic coupling, atmospheric pressure variations, or other Earth system interactions that fall outside conventional seismic modeling. If the plate boundary is really reorganizing beneath California, if the Walker lane is genuinely activating as a primary plate boundary, the consequences won't be subtle. They won't be limited to gradual GPS measurements and academic debates about strain rates. The consequences will involve ground rupture, infrastructure failure, and human casualties on a scale that California hasn't experienced in modern history. And if those consequences are coming, understanding what triggers them, what conditions the system to fail sooner rather than later, becomes more than academic curiosity. It becomes survival information. Because the jump, if it happens, won't announce itself with warning sirens and evacuation orders. It will announce itself with shaking. Let's be very clear about what we're discussing here. This is disciplined speculation, not prediction. The scenarios described in this section are based on geological plausibility and historical precedent, but they are not forecasts of specific events or timelines. Earthquakes cannot be predicted with precision. Anyone claiming otherwise is either misinformed or lying. What we can do is explore consequences, examine what restructuring of California's plate boundary would look like if the processes already underway continue to their logical conclusions. What happens if the Walker Lane truly becomes the dominant plate boundary? What happens if faults that have been quiet during recorded history decide to wake up? A structural jump in plate boundary location means that strain accumulating over decades or centuries suddenly releases through faults that weren't previously considered primary hazards. This isn't hypothetical. The geological record is full of examples where fault systems reorganized, where new faults activated while old ones went quiet. The North Anatolian Fault in Turkey has propagated westward over the past century through a series of magnitude 7 earthquakes, each rupture triggering the next like dominoes falling in sequence. The Marlborough Fault system in New Zealand took over plate boundary motion from offshore faults roughly 5 million years ago. These transitions happen. They're part of how plate tectonics works. What makes California's situation unique is that we're potentially watching it happen in real time, with millions of people living directly above the transitioning boundary. The Walker Lane is geometrically complex, not a single continuous fault, but a network of interconnected segments with different orientations and slip rates. This complexity matters enormously for rupture mechanics. When a large earthquake begins, the initial rupture can propagate along the fault plane at speeds approaching the speed of sound in rock. If that rupture encounters a geometric barrier, a bend or offset in the fault, it might stop. But if the rupture encounters another fault segment favorably oriented for continued braking, it can jump the gap and keep going, linking multiple segments into a single, longer rupture. Longer ruptures mean larger magnitudes. A 50-kilometer fault produces a magnitude 6.5 earthquake. A 100-kilometer fault produces a magnitude 7. A 200-kilometer fault produces a magnitude 7.5. The Walker Lane spans 1,000 kilometers. Not all of that would rupture in a single event, but even a partial rupture could be catastrophic. Why is magnitude 7.5 discussed specifically? Because that's roughly what you get from a 100 to 150 kilometer fault rupture, with several meters of slip, and the Walker Lane has segments of that length with enough accumulated strain to produce that amount of slip. This isn't a worst-case scenario pulled from disaster movies. It's a geologically reasonable outcome based on fault geometry and slip rate. Historical precedent supports it too. The 1915 Pleasant Valley earthquake in Nevada, along part of the Walker Lane system, was magnitude 7.2 and ruptured over 50 kilometers of previously unmapped faults. The 1872 Owens Valley earthquake in California was magnitude 7.4 to 7.9, producing up to 6 meters of slip. These events demonstrated what the region is capable of. They just happened when Nevada and Eastern California were sparsely populated and largely ignored by the rest of the country. Infrastructure exposure is the real concern. Coastal California has spent decades retrofitting buildings, reinforcing bridges, and preparing emergency response systems for San Andreas earthquakes. Inland cities have not. Reno, Nevada. Carson City. Bishop, California. Susanville. These communities aren't built to the same seismic standards as San Francisco or Los Angeles. The building codes are less stringent. The awareness is lower. Many structures predate modern earthquake engineering entirely. When the inevitable Walker Lane earthquake occurs, and it will occur eventually, even if not in our lifetimes, these communities will be disproportionately affected. Not because the earthquake will necessarily be larger than a San Andreas event, but because the infrastructure simply isn't ready. You won't find detailed rupture scenario maps for the Walker Lane publicized the way San Andreas scenarios are. This isn't a conspiracy. It's a planning versus panic calculation. Emergency managers face a difficult choice: publish detailed scenarios and risk causing alarm that leads to economic disruption and public distrust if nothing happens immediately, or withhold scenarios and risk being accused of hiding information when an event eventually occurs. Most agencies thread this needle by acknowledging the hazard in technical documents while avoiding graphic depictions of destruction. The maps exist. They're in government reports and academic papers. They're just not featured in public outreach campaigns. Now for the part that captures imaginations but needs careful framing: the Nevada coastline idea. If the Walker Lane fully takes over as the primary plate boundary and the San Andreas becomes inactive, California west of the fault system would continue moving northwest relative to the rest of North America. Over millions of years, this could lead to separation, creating a new oceanic basin east of what is now coastal California. Nevada wouldn't literally become beachfront property in any time frame humans care about, but the geological trajectory is real. This is how continents break apart. This is how ocean basins form. The Atlantic Ocean started as a continental rift, not unlike the Walker Lane. It just had 180 million years to open up. The cinematic imagery of California snapping off like a piece of breaking glass is entertaining, but false. Continental rifting is gradual, occurring over timescales where mountains erode away and new ones form. What would change first, what would change on human timescales, isn't geography, but infrastructure vulnerability. Power transmission lines cross the Walker Lane in multiple places. The Pacific Intertie, which carries electricity from the Pacific Northwest to Southern California, crosses the fault system in northern Nevada. A magnitude 7 earthquake could sever these lines, cutting power to millions. Water infrastructure is similarly exposed. The California Aqueduct, which supplies water to 25 million people, crosses the San Andreas, but also comes perilously close to active Walker Lane faults. GPS networks, which rely on precise positioning to function, could experience disruptions if ground displacement is severe enough. The infrastructure is a web, and webs are only as strong as their weakest threads. What about warning? Would we see it coming? The Susanville swarm might be a precursor. Or it might be a false alarm, seismic noise that dies out without consequence. The African antipodal event might have conditioned faults. Or it might be entirely irrelevant, a coincidence we're overinterpreting. Precursory phenomena before large earthquakes are notoriously unreliable. Sometimes there are foreshocks, sometimes there aren't. Sometimes groundwater levels change days before a rupture, sometimes they don't. Sometimes animals behave strangely. Sometimes they're completely oblivious. The ground doesn't send telegrams announcing its intentions. It just breaks when stress exceeds strength, and that transition can happen in seconds after centuries of buildup. Emphasizing uncertainty is not cowardice, it's honesty. Earthquake science has made tremendous progress over the past century, but prediction remains impossible. We understand the mechanics. We can measure strain accumulation. We can map faults with extraordinary precision. We just can't say when any given fault will rupture. The best we can do is probabilistic forecasting, stating that certain regions have certain percentage chances of experiencing certain magnitudes within certain timeframes. The Walker Lane has a high probability of producing a magnitude 7 earthquake within the next 30 years. Whether that's 3 years from now or 29 years from now, we cannot say. But here's what we should remember. Earth isn't the only system showing signs of stress right now. While we've been focusing on seismic data and tectonic models, other planetary systems have begun behaving in ways that don't quite fit expectations. The atmosphere is changing. Satellites are experiencing drag that models didn't predict. AI systems trained on decades of Earth observation data are increasingly reporting confidence intervals that widen rather than narrow. When multiple complex systems begin deviating from established patterns simultaneously, it suggests something broader is happening, something that transcends individual disciplines and requires us to think about the planet as an integrated whole rather than a collection of isolated processes. The crust might be responding not just to mechanical stress, but to changes in Earth's electromagnetic environment, atmospheric dynamics, and perhaps other factors we haven't even considered yet. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question: what else is acting strange right now? Satellite operators have noticed something odd over the past 18 months. Objects in low Earth orbit, particularly those between 400 and 600 kilometers altitude, are experiencing atmospheric drag that exceeds model predictions. Drag is the enemy of satellites, the friction from residual atmosphere that gradually slows them down and pulls them toward Earth. Engineers design satellites with this in mind, calculating how much fuel they'll need for periodic boosts to maintain their orbits. The calculations depend on atmospheric models that predict density at different altitudes based on solar activity, seasonal variations, and historical averages. Those models are increasingly wrong. The upper atmosphere is expanding. Specifically, the thermosphere, the layer of atmosphere between 80 and 600 kilometers altitude, is puffing up beyond expected bounds. This isn't a small discrepancy. Some satellites are burning through station-keeping fuel 30% faster than planned. Orbital decay rates for defunct satellites and space debris are accelerating, meaning objects that were expected to remain in orbit for decades might deorbit within years. The International Space Station has required more frequent reboosts. Communication satellites are experiencing service degradations as their orbits drift more than predicted. Companies operating large satellite constellations like Starlink have had to adjust deployment strategies and maintenance schedules. Why is the atmosphere expanding? The primary driver is solar activity. When the sun is active, it emits more extreme ultraviolet radiation and high-energy particles that heat the upper atmosphere, causing it to expand. This is well understood and normally predictable. Solar cycle 25 should be producing a moderate expansion, nothing exceptional. But the observed expansion exceeds what the cycle's activity level should produce. Something else is contributing to atmospheric heating, or the atmosphere is responding more sensitively to solar input than models assumed, or both. Researchers are investigating multiple hypotheses involving changes in atmospheric composition, altered circulation patterns, and coupling effects between different atmospheric layers that weren't accounted for in previous models. This matters for more than just satellites. The upper atmosphere isn't isolated from the lower atmosphere or from the ground beneath our feet. The entire Earth system is connected through energy flows, electromagnetic fields, and complex feedback loops. Changes in the thermosphere can affect ionospheric conductivity, which influences how geomagnetic storms propagate through the planet's electromagnetic environment, which might affect ground currents in the crust. These are not simple cause and effect chains. They're networked interactions where small changes in one part of the system can cascade through other parts in non-linear ways. The technical term for this is coupling, and it's one of the hardest aspects of Earth science to model because the interactions span such different scales and involve such different physics. AI-based Earth system models are revealing the limits of our predictive capabilities in uncomfortable ways. For decades, scientists have built models of climate, weather, ocean currents, and tectonic processes using physics-based equations and observational data. These models work reasonably well for hindcasting, explaining past behavior once we know what happened. They work less well for forecasting, predicting future behavior before it occurs. The recent explosion in AI and machine learning offered hope that neural networks trained on decades of satellite observations, seismic records, and atmospheric measurements could discover patterns that traditional physics-based models miss. In some cases, this has worked brilliantly. In other cases, it's exposed how little we actually understand. What AI models are increasingly showing is not improved prediction, but increased uncertainty. As these systems ingest more data and identify more subtle patterns, they're also discovering more exceptions, more instances where established relationships break down. Weather forecasting beyond the 10 days remains essentially guesswork because atmospheric chaos dominates. Climate projections diverge wildly depending on how feedback loops between ice, clouds, and ocean circulation are parameterized. Earthquake forecasting remains impossible because fault systems are so complex and the relevant variables so numerous that prediction requires precision we simply don't have. Adding more data and more computational power hasn't solved these problems. It's revealed how profound they are. Scientists sometimes describe these challenges using the term coupled systems, a concept borrowed from physics and engineering. A coupled system is one where multiple subsystems interact, where changes in one component affect others, which then feed back to affect the first component. Earth is the ultimate coupled system. The atmosphere couples to the ocean through heat and moisture exchange. The ocean couples to the crust through bottom pressure and tidal loading. The crust couples to the electromagnetic field through conductive pathways and piezoelectric effects in minerals. The electromagnetic field couples to the upper atmosphere through solar-wind interactions. These couplings operate across timescales from milliseconds to millions of years, and no single scientific discipline has the tools or expertise to study them all simultaneously. When multiple subsystems of a coupled system begin exhibiting anomalous behavior at the same time, it can mean one of two things. Either we're experiencing random coincidences, unrelated events that just happen to cluster temporally through bad luck, or something is driving correlated changes across multiple subsystems, some forcing function that affects atmospheric dynamics, seismic activity, and electromagnetic conditions simultaneously. The obvious candidate is solar activity, which does influence all these domains. But as we've discussed, solar cycle 25 shouldn't be causing the magnitude of changes being observed, which means either the sun is acting stranger than we realize, or there are coupling mechanisms between Earth systems that amplify solar forcing in ways not captured by current models. This is where correlation versus causation becomes genuinely frustrating. We can observe that atmospheric expansion coincides with increased seismic monitoring alerts. We can note that geomagnetic storm frequency correlates loosely with periods of elevated earthquake activity in certain regions. We can document that AI model confidence intervals are widening across multiple Earth science domains simultaneously. But we cannot prove these observations reflect a common underlying cause. We cannot rule out the possibility that they're all independent phenomena that just happen to be occurring during the same few years. Correlation, no matter how suggestive, never proves causation without a mechanistic explanation that can be tested experimentally. Yet, here's the thing about complex systems. By the time you have ironclad proof of causation, by the time you understand the mechanism well enough to make predictions, the event you were trying to predict has usually already happened. Complex systems don't announce their transitions. They undergo them, often abruptly, and scientists figure out why afterward. The transition from Ice Age to interglacial period doesn't wait for paleoclimatologists to perfect their models. It happens when the coupled ocean-atmosphere-ice system reaches a threshold, and then it proceeds whether we understand it or not. Earthquake rupture doesn't wait for seismologists to calculate stress fields to 6 decimal places. It happens when stress exceeds strength, and then we measure the ground motion and try to understand why it happened, where, and when it did. What we're watching right now across multiple scientific domains might be nothing, a random confluence of unrelated anomalies that will be forgotten in 5 years when things return to normal patterns. Or it might be the early stages of a restructuring event, a period where multiple Earth systems simultaneously adjust to new equilibrium states. The Walker Lane becoming seismically active, the atmosphere responding more sensitively to solar forcing, electromagnetic conditions persisting longer after storms. None of these individually proves anything. Together, they form a pattern. And patterns, even uncertain ones, even ones we can't fully explain, demand attention. Because the pattern beneath the noise, if it's real, if it's not just our pattern-seeking brains finding order in chaos, suggests something is changing. Something broader than individual faults or weather systems or satellite orbits. Something planetary in scale. And that brings us to the most important question of all. If the pattern is real, what are we supposed to do about it? No single data point proves anything. Not the African antipodal event, not the Susanville swarm, not the atmospheric expansion or the extended plasmasphere recovery, or the increased seismic monitoring alerts. Each observation, taken alone, has alternative explanations. Each could be coincidence, natural variability, measurement error, or observer bias. This is the fundamental challenge of complex system analysis. Individual signals are ambiguous. Patterns only become visible when you step back and look at multiple signals simultaneously. And even then, you're never quite sure if the pattern is real or if you're imposing structure on randomness. History is full of patterns that only made sense in retrospect. Before the 2004 Sumatra earthquake, there were increased background tremors across the Indian Ocean region. Nobody connected them into a coherent pattern. After the quake, researchers went back through seismic records and found clear precursory activity that had been ignored because it seemed unremarkable at the time. Before the 2011 Tohoku disaster, GPS stations in Japan detected subtle ground deformation consistent with deep, slow slip events on the megathrust fault. These were noted in technical papers, but didn't trigger evacuation orders because slow slip happens frequently and rarely leads to major ruptures. After the magnitude 9.1 earthquake and tsunami killed nearly 20,000 people, those same slow slip events were retroactively identified as precursors. The problem with precursors is that they're only definitive after the fact. For every slow slip event that preceded a major earthquake, there are 10 that preceded nothing. For every increase in background seismicity that came before a large rupture, there are 20 that dissipated without consequence. False positives vastly outnumber true positives in earthquake precursor research, which is why seismologists are so reluctant to issue predictions. The costs of false alarms, both economic and social, are immediate and tangible. The costs of missed warnings only become apparent if the disaster actually occurs. Given this asymmetry, the conservative choice is to wait for certainty, to avoid crying wolf, to issue warnings only when evidence is overwhelming. The problem is that by the time evidence is overwhelming, it's usually too late. Waiting for certainty is historically dangerous in complex systems. Financial markets don't wait for economists to confirm a recession before crashing. Climate systems don't wait for perfect carbon budget calculations before crossing tipping points. Pandemics don't wait for epidemiological models to converge before spreading exponentially. The systems move on their own timescales, governed by their own internal dynamics, indifferent to human understanding or preparation. Earthquake systems are no different. The crust will rupture when stress fields reach critical thresholds, not when seismologists finally agree on a consensus forecast. So what should we watch for in the coming days, weeks, and months? What signals would indicate that the current situation is escalating rather than dissipating? There are a few key indicators. First, continued seismic activity in the Susanville region. If the swarm persists beyond 2 weeks, which it's already done, and extends into 3 or 4 weeks, that becomes increasingly unusual. Swarms lasting a month are rare. Swarms lasting 2 months are very rare, and almost always precede larger events or volcanic activity. Second, any expansion of seismicity beyond the immediate Susanville area into other parts of the Walker Lane system. If we start seeing swarms near Pyramid Lake, or increased activity in Owens Valley, or clusters along the Nevada-California border, that suggests strain is redistributing along the entire fault system rather than releasing locally. Third, continued anomalies in atmospheric and electromagnetic monitoring. If satellite drag remains elevated, if plasmasphere recovery times continue exceeding predictions, if geomagnetic storm impacts seem disproportionate to solar activity levels, those are indicators that Earth's coupled systems are operating in a perturbed state. Fourth, and perhaps most telling, watch for changes in institutional language. When agencies like the USGS shift from standard monitoring reports to elevated advisory language, even subtle changes in wording can signal internal concern. When seismologists, who normally speak in probabilities and uncertainties, start talking about specific scenarios and timelines, that's a tell. Experts don't alarm easily. If they're alarmed, there's usually a reason. The next 30 days are critical, not because anything is certain to happen within that time frame, but because patterns that emerge now will inform assessments for the next 90 days, which will inform planning for the next 300 days. Seismic hazard assessment is recursive, constantly updating as new data arrives. Each day, without a major event, slightly decreases probability for the next day, but each new precursory signal slightly increases it. The math is Bayesian, probabilistic, never deterministic. All we can say is whether the odds are shifting in concerning directions. Silence from institutions can mean two things. Either there's nothing concerning happening, and silence reflects genuine lack of worry, or there's something concerning happening, and silence reflects a decision that public communication carries more risk than benefit. Distinguishing between these is difficult from the outside. Internal communications between monitoring agencies, academic seismologists, and emergency managers are not public. We only see the official statements, the press releases, the carefully worded advisories. What gets discussed behind closed doors? What scenarios get modeled in classified briefings? We don't know. This information asymmetry is inevitable. No government can operate transparently when discussing potential disasters, both for security reasons and to avoid panic. But it means the absence of public warnings doesn't equal the absence of private concern. Geological transitions don't announce themselves. They don't issue press releases or hold press conferences. The plate boundary beneath California has been migrating eastward for millions of years, invisible to all but the most sophisticated monitoring systems. That migration will continue for millions more years, proceeding at its own pace regardless of human observation. What's unusual about this particular moment in geological time is that we're watching it happen with technology sophisticated enough to detect millimeter-scale motions and millisecond-scale variations in seismic wave propagation. We're seeing details that no previous human generation could see. But seeing detail doesn't equal understanding mechanism. We're like people watching gears turn inside a complex machine without quite knowing what the machine does or when it might break. Maps don't change overnight. The map of California in standard atlases will show the same coastline and borders in 2027 as it showed in 2026. The map in geology textbooks showing the San Andreas as the primary plate boundary will remain accurate for decades, possibly centuries. Official seismic hazard maps will update gradually as new data accumulates, shifting probability contours incrementally. Changes in human-made maps lag behind changes in geological reality. The ground has already begun its transition. The maps are just catching up. Reality does change overnight, though. Not geological reality, but the reality of where hazard is concentrated, where strain is accumulating fastest, where the next rupture is most likely. That reality has already shifted. The Walker Lane is not a future problem. It's a present hazard that most California residents don't know about and most infrastructure wasn't designed for. The seismic risk portfolio of the American West is rebalancing, moving from coastal urban areas to inland rural areas, from well-prepared communities to underprepared ones. This rebalancing happens silently, invisibly, documented only in academic papers and technical reports that most people never read. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that uncertainty should not be mistaken for ignorance. We're uncertain about precise timing and location, about which signals matter and which are noise. But we're not ignorant about the broader process. The Walker Lane is active. Plate boundaries migrate. Immature fault systems eventually organize into mature ones through earthquakes. The physics is understood. The specifics are not. And in complex systems, the specifics are what determine consequences. A magnitude 7 earthquake in an empty desert causes geological interest, but minimal human impact. The same earthquake beneath a city kills thousands and causes billions in damage. The difference isn't the earthquake, it's where and when it happens. So we watch. We monitor GPS stations and seismographs. We track solar activity and atmospheric density. We analyze water chemistry in wells and measure fault creep on surface traces. We build models that incorporate more variables and run simulations that explore more scenarios. We prepare emergency response plans and retrofit infrastructure and educate communities. We do all the things that rational societies do when facing low probability, high consequence risks. And we acknowledge that all of it might not be enough, because the Earth operates on timescales and follows rules that don't care about human preparedness or political will or economic convenience. The pattern beneath the noise, if it's there, if it's real and not pareidolia, suggests that California's geological identity is already changing. Not over millions of years, but over decades and centuries. Not someday, but starting now. The Susanville swarm might be the first chapter of a longer story. Or it might be a false start, a sentence fragment that never becomes a paragraph. We won't know which until more chapters unfold. But the book is being written whether we read it or not. The Earth is revising its tectonic architecture, rewriting the boundaries between plates, testing new configurations of stress and strain. And we get to watch, record, analyze, and hopefully prepare. Because the one thing we can say with certainty is that the ground beneath California will shake again. The only questions are where, when, and how ready we'll be when it does.